Everybody's got a story. What's yours?
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 15 of Cool Story with David J. MacNeil. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your support. This episode features a chat with an entertainer that I admire very much, Seán Cullen. When I moved to Toronto in 1995, I scraped together what little cash I had and enrolled to study improv at the Second City, where a lot of my favorite performers had cut their teeth as well. Artists like John Candy, Eugene Levy, Martin Short, Andrea Martin, Rick Moranis, Catherine O'Hara, Dan Aykroyd, Jane Eastwood, Gilda Radner, Joe Flaherty, and Mike Myers, just to name a few. If I wanted to be a performer, I'd have to learn to stand on a stage and be in the moment. The years that I spent at the Second City Toronto were some of the best of times. I found a tribe of misfits to play with, many of whom I still call dear friends today. And when we weren't jockeying for a spot on the roster at the local drop-in improv stages around the city, we were out learning from some of the best improvisers in the country. And the one improviser we all wanted to see was Seán Cullen. Smart as a whip, quick like a cat, and fearless. Or so it appeared. A founding member of Corky and the Juice Pigs, Seán has toured the world appearing on stage at the Edinburgh Comedy Festival, multiple appearances at the Winnipeg Comedy Festival, and Montreal's Just for Laughs. Seán has appeared on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, The Ellen Show, The Royal Canadian Air Farce, Last Comic Standing, and so on, and so on, and so on. Actor, writer, singer, improviser, comedian, and novelist. Seán makes the triple threats look like underachievers. So when the opportunity presented itself to sit down with Seán, I jumped on it. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Seán Cullen. Hello, Seán Cullen. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm so pleased that you were able to join me for the podcast. This is a real thrill. I wanted to have you on the show because it's probably not best that a host fanboys too much, but if you will give me a moment, I'll do a bit of that nonetheless. Years ago when I moved to Toronto in 1995 and embarked on a career in show business, one of the first things I did was I started studying at Second City, which is one of the best things I've ever done. And I would suggest any performer studies improv. And while I was doing that, when we weren't performing ourselves, we were going out to see a lot of shows. And one of the people that we always wanted to see was Seán Cullen live, because in those days, even back then, you were kind of at the top of Mount Olympus of improvisers. So I really enjoyed seeing you a number of times at the Rivoli. I got a chance to see your Wood, Cheese, and Children special, your Comedy Now special, when you recorded that.
Oh.
So that's how you first sort of got onto my radar, was through improv and being a lover of improv and going out to see the best of the best. And so I had an opportunity to see you. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm so glad you think that. Otherwise, I don't know why you'd be talking to me. It'd be a waste of time.
One of my favorite bits that you used to do back in the day, and I don't know if you still do it these days, but if it was the only thing that you had done, I would still be a massive fan. And that was when you used to do Food of Choice.
Mm-hmm. Food of your choice will end your life tonight. Yeah, people love that. It gets the samey because I take suggestions from the audience, and they always give me the same thing: pizza, tortilla chips, a hot dog. It's always the same. Spaghetti. So it got a little boring for me, but it is a fun bit, and I really enjoyed doing it. I haven't done it in a long while.
Yeah, it was one of those bits too that was kind of like watching somebody ride a bull. The further you got into it, the more people cheered, and they could see that you were really, you'd fight through those bits where you were, trying to keep on track and amplify it. And then you'd go into that crescendo and people would follow you, and they would just, at the end, there'd be a triumphant finish and people would lose their minds.
Well, I hope they didn't lose their minds. But the thing is, it's fun to, what I like to do is bring people on a journey, and I think they do root for you to succeed. They want to laugh. People want to laugh. And when they watch you, struggling but moving through it, they really enjoy watching that. It's a great process for the audience.
Do you remember the moment, or was there a moment when you figured out this is what I want to do with my life? That
I still haven't figured that out.
no,
I know I'm still, I don't know. I've always had lots of interests, but comedy has been the most, time encompassing of my life. And I never really thought I'd be a comedian. I always loved Saturday Night Live. I loved the Pythons. I
yeah,
loved, I love Second City. Was big when I was, my formative years. And
mhm,
I used to love all of that sketch comedy, and I always dreamed of being that. And I
mhm,
never was that. I've always been a kind of improviser, a kind of, it's not really improvising. I like to extemporizing. It's stream of consciousness. It's living in the moment sort of thing.
mhm,
I, and, but I never really planned on being a comedian per se. It's a funny thing because I do a lot of different things. I write novels for young adult
mhm.
readers. I write a lot of animation. I do voice work. Uh, I do comedy. I act, I don't feel like I'm fully in any of those circles, and I always feel like an outsider at every single one. Like I don't really feel like I'm. I don't know. I grew up in comedy at a time where it was dominated by stand-ups, and they all thought the only thing that's real comedy is stand-up comedy with a microphone
Sure.
and a guy. And I never felt like I belonged in that format, you know. So it's been a problem, I think, being diversified like this to diffuse your impact in a lot of ways. It gives me lots of opportunities, but sometimes I think if I just did one thing really well, I'd be way farther ahead in my life. But I get distracted, I guess. But when did I start doing it? Yeah, I guess I started wanting to do it when I saw. I just remember seeing. I was 10, and my dad would let us stay up on Saturday night, and he would make pizza,
Mhm.
and then we'd watch Saturday Night Live, and that came on in 1975. And I remember the ads leading up to it going, oh, something crazy is happening on Saturday night. And it was
Right.
George Carlin was the first host. And I just remember that first season with Chevy Chase doing his falls every
Yeah.
day, every show. He would fall, do an elaborate fall. And
Right. Sure. That was when Chevy Chase used to play his iconic President Gerald Ford character.
Gerald Ford, he would always,
Yeah.
I just loved it was not anything. Like he didn't look like Gerald Ford. They did no makeup for him. It was
Yeah.
just really funny. But I just saw that's something I'd love to do. That's something really interesting to me, and I always loved comedy. And I loved just the more absurd, the better. Like for me, Pythons are I guess would be my favorite.
Yeah.
Growing up, they were
Did you
like
used
the
to buy
good.
the albums?
I did buy the albums, tie and matching handkerchief,
Yeah, I have that one.
another Monty Python album,
Yeah.
a bunch of them. I love them, and they were just so crazy, But they were really, you could tell they were really smart men doing stupid things, and I thought
Hmm.
that's an amazing combination. I'd love to do that.
Yeah.
And we were lucky in Canada because we got both sides of comedy. We got British comedy. We saw a lot of British, like we saw Benny Hill and, the Carry On movies and all of that British heritage stuff
Yeah.
and Monty Python and the Goodies and all of these things. And then we'd also get American comedy. And we kind of had a bridge between where we could appreciate the absurd, but have this ability to be observational, to observe. Most comedy in America is observational. It's changing now, but it was at the time. It was like, you ever seen that? You ever seen somebody do that? Isn't
Sure.
it weird how that guy does that? And it was very not. I'm not going to say pedestrian, but it was very direct. It wasn't absurd or
Hmm.
or crazy. It wasn't insane the
Yeah.
way like Monty Python was, but it was valid and good, I love listening now to radio shows by Jack Benny's radio shows. They have a channel on Sirius XM that's all old radio programs. The great George Burns and Gracie Allen, just really funny, and even people like Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, who are funny people, and they were great at delivering a line, So that kind of more prosaic, I guess would be the word, straight ahead comedy, I kind of mix it with the weird, the absurd that I got from the British influence.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, the mix of comedy that we got to enjoy as Canadians. And I think the thing that young people who know Saturday Night Live today don't realize is how revolutionary Saturday Night Live was in the early days. SNL was really the first group of people, young people, doing comedy on TV, because it had been all the older folks who had been doing it before. And then all of a sudden it was this renegade bunch of young people who were doing sort of counterculture comedy. And that was explosive and exciting to watch.
Well, yeah. I mean, before that, you'd have things like John Kirshner's rock concert and these weird kind of music shows. It was kind of a dead spot in the television schedule. And when they said, just like, I think Lorne Michaels has said that they just said, don't give me a time you don't care about. And then let me do whatever I want. Like they got no oversight because no one cared about that slot.
Exactly.
And it was just amazingly revolutionary. I mean, it was current. It was about things that had happened that week. They did it live. It was crazy. Like, I mean, but it's not. It's everything old is new again. I mean, television was live when it started. All those comedy shows like Milton Berle and
Sure.
Sid Caesar's show of shows. They were all done live, and they would rehearse all week and then do the show live. And it was just the change in that happened over the 60s and 70s, and then this show live is insane that they came back with, and it was brilliant. I really, really loved watching it, and the music guests they would have. Everybody, nowadays, if you have a hit album, you are the musical guest. But back then, it was they would have hosts like Elliot Gould, and you'd be like, what? And they would pick whoever they wanted to be their musical guest. So you get people like Leon Redbone and Sparks and Peter Tosh and people that were just amazing, but not like mainstream music stars.
Right.
And it was really interesting. Everything about it was interesting. And Devo as well was one of the musical guests. And you're just like, what is this going on?
Yeah.
It was crazy. Yeah. And the little movies they'd make that, they were just great. Like, it was so different from everything that was going on. And I was just captivated by it and really look forward to seeing it every week and loved it so much. But I've always loved late night comedy. I used to love watching Johnny Carson. My parents would let us stay up and watch Johnny Carson. I loved him. And I think David Letterman is my other favorite because he kind of carried on that tradition in a way. Like, it's all gimmicky now. Like, Jimmy Kimmel's very good, I think. I don't really like watching The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. Like, it's just a bunch of games and a bunch of kind of self-aggrandizing moments for himself. And I don't buy it. I loved when Letterman loved his audience. Johnny Carson loves his audience. And David Letterman was cranky guy.
Especially in the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he still, when he would go out in the audience and talk to them and do little, contests and stuff, he loved talking to them. Like, he was genuinely enjoyed his audience. And they weren't just someone like come there to clap their hands for him. Like Jay Leno, I was on the show many times. Well, 5 times, I guess. And I just didn't really like the vibe. It felt like it was this like tourist attraction almost, like come and touch Jay Leno, and it was always, there was something insincere about it that I just didn't enjoy. And I always thought David Letterman and Johnny Carson were absolutely sincere.
Well, I think David Letterman's audience too was a youthful audience, and Jay Leno was casting a much wider net. So I think he had to appeal to a lot more people, and to the younger people, it lost its edge.
Oh, for sure.
Where Letterman just zeroed in on his crowd. He knew who his audience was and who he was talking to, I think.
Well, what people don't remember, but he had a show in the afternoon in the late 70s, I think. It was like a weird afternoon talk show.
Yeah.
And it didn't last. It was a year. I think it went for a year.
Yeah, it was a season.
Season even, yeah. And it was so weird for that to happen in the middle of the day. Like, it was so weird.
It was like watching a vampire in broad daylight.
It was crazy. And but he honed a lot of what he came up with later on this talk show, late night show, that he tried a lot of that stuff and learned a lot from it, I think.
Were you a kid who performed for family at home?
Well, my mother used to make me sing for people.
Okay.
I used to sing, and she would make me sing for my grandparents, and I'd make up little songs about stuff like that, or sing little Irish songs that they liked. And she made me enter the Kiwanis Music Festival every year, that sort of thing, and do little talent shows. I sang in church with a folk choir that was kind of weird, but it was fun. But it gave me, I enjoyed doing that, And then when I finally said, "Oh, I'm going to be a performer for a living," my mom was like, "What are you, crazy? You don't do that for a living."
What did your parents do for a living?
Well, my mother was a nurse.
Mm-hmm.
She's kind of an interesting, I find her interesting, her path, but she was grew up on a farm just outside of Kingston. Very old Irish immigrants, and they were given, my great grandfather was given some land as part of his benefits from being in the army, and it was up around Kingston, and he got that and made a farm out of it. And my mother and her four siblings grew up there, and she left to go to high school. She wanted to pursue, and she went to Newburgh High School. She had to board and go to high school, so she left home. And then she went and boarded at Hotel Dieu in Kingston, became a nurse, and then moved to Peterborough, where I grew up, and became first an obstetrics nurse and then an emergency nurse. And then my father was he quit school after grade 8, and then got a job in General Electric, which was a big factory in Peterborough at the time. And he was kind of one of those guys who grew up during the Depression, where you had to learn to do everything. You had to learn to do plumbing, you had to do electrical, you had to do bricklaying, fix your own car, everything like that, because you would never be able to pay for somebody to do it. So he was very good with his hands, but just worked in this factory and got paid very well. They both worked very hard, long shifts. They'd work 12 hours on, 12 hours off, sort of thing. But they were. My mom loved the idea of entertainment, like people being able to do things like that. Like I thought, she grew up on a farm, and her idea of amazing was if somebody could play the fiddle, and they'd get come over to the farm, and people would get together, and they'd have a night of music or whatever, and that would be amazing. So she loved that. And my father, I think, really enjoyed watching Saturday Night Live with us. He's a very quiet guy, but I think he enjoyed it. And I think he liked comedy as well. But I don't know. They were very working class people. They were very, my mother was pretty well educated. My dad, not so much. But, they just very working class. I just worked hard.
Yeah, I'm sure that a career in show business would have seemed like something that people from very far away might be able to do or whatever, but
Sure.
that's not what we do.
Well, they love watching Johnny Carson. They love the people who come on, the comedians, whatever like that. But they can never imagine why would you do that with your life?
Yeah.
Like and the struggle of it. Like when all of my friends are like graduating from university and starting in a bank or making money, and I'm like, hey, can I borrow $10? It was it's tough at the beginning. And, you're thinking, maybe I did something wrong. But it's like any business. If you start your own business, it takes 10 years to really get your stuff together and make it work.
It takes a lot of borrowing $10.
Yes. Well, I think my mom finally got that I was doing well when I got, of all things, a Butterfinger commercial where I didn't even speak in the commercial. I just ran up and grabbed a Butterfinger and ran away. And that was it. But she saw it on the TV and people called her and said, is that your son in the Butterfinger commercial? So that validated everything that I did.
Yeah. Funny the way that works.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so what happens when SCTV comes along?
Well, what I think it did, it started this idea that you could do it. Like you could be like they shot it in Edmonton. It was very rough and ready and, seat of the pants, but they were doing it and they were making it work. And it made, I think, lots of people who are into comedy look at it as a possibility, like there was a chance that it could be done, that you could have a career in comedy and become relevant in a big way. So that was very helpful. And also seeing Jim Carrey, who, was a local Toronto guy, go from doing clubs in Canada to becoming an enormous star in America. So it just gave everybody this idea that it was possible, that it wasn't futile. What you were doing was could be valid. And so a lot of people started to do it. And now there's such a rich heritage of sketch and stand up in Canada. And, I think it comes down to those two successes in a big way.
Why do you think it is that Canadian comics have always done well in the US? Is it that we have a unique perspective on their culture because we live outside of the bubble or that echo chamber?
I think it's absolutely true that we have an objective view of American culture and American politics, American life. We have a lot in common, but we are different in some very basic ways. Like, for example, the whole gun situation. Like in Canada, it's not that hard to buy a gun, really. You can go for 2 weeks, 2 weekends to do a course, and then you can buy a gun. But people don't have them. People don't buy them. They just don't need them. And that mentality just isn't there where, if you ask most Americans, we buy guns to protect ourselves from the government is what one of the big answers. And I just say, wow, that's I never really felt that need, so that's just one of the many examples of how we have a different viewpoint. I think Canada, we have a very good way of life. We have a good economy. We have a good standard of living, but we don't have that kind of clout that Americans have, that the American culture has. This world-spanning influence on people. And what we do as a country doesn't have the influence or the effect that what America chooses to do has around the globe. So we have to learn about the rest of the world. We have an awareness about the rest of the world that I don't think America has. Like when America, I don't think most people knew where Iraq was or Afghanistan was until they had to invade them,
Right.
But in Canada, you do have an awareness of the world. You're affected by it in a much greater way. In America, you're your world is America for the most part. There's no reason to look anywhere else. It's so big. The culture is so big. The economy is so big that you don't need to really care about the rest of the world. And I think Canada has to. And so we have a broader sense of humanity, of culture, of differences of other people. And I think that when we bring that to bear on comedy, the difference is quite striking, that we can have a broader frame of reference than American comics can. When you go down to America, when I first went down, I was just like, here's a guy, like, well, I would go to the Improv or the Comedy Store and or the Comedy Factory, and you just say, wow, the comedy here is so limited in scope. People just talk about themselves or about, I'm a Hispanic, and this is what my life is. And we just in Canada just don't have that luxury. We have to have a broader frame of reference. I think it's changing now. I think it's becoming more like that up here. But when I first started, we were in a transitional period, I think, between giving over. Britain was our primary focus. All of our cultural institutions come from there. Royalty, crown, corporations, socialism, and we're slowly drifting into the American sphere. And so we would have both, Monty Python. We'd love that. I loved it and grew up on it, and the Goodies and all these other British comedy influences. But and we'd also have access to sitcoms and All in the Family and Saturday Night Live when it started, and all of those kind of American comedy influences. So we're kind of a hybrid.
Yeah,
gives us a broader frame of reference, as I said earlier, and helps us in a way to have a deeper understanding, maybe, of the comedy world.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that you'd lived in the U.S. for a number of years, and you told me that you had a place in Los Angeles for a bunch of years. How did you enjoy that experience?
Well, I loved it. I really love California. The great thing about California is that you just step out the door and it's amazing. The weather is always beautiful. Every day is pretty much the same. It's so different. I come from Toronto, where you walk places to, it's so much more condensed. Or like the difference is, say, in New York. If you come from New York, you walk everywhere and you walk by a place like a restaurant. You go, that looks like a cool restaurant. I think I'll go in. And in America, you're driving everywhere. Everything's by appointment. And you drive along, you're driving in your car and you won't drive by somebody's, no, that looks like a nice restaurant. I'll probably never go there because I'm just not going to stop, So it's a different world. It's much more insular, Los Angeles. Like you have to have friends, and you have to make appointments to keep those friends, and you have to be connected. It's easy to just drift and be alone. And the one thing I noticed was time passes without you noticing it. Like you can be there for 5 years and it seems like you just got there because there's no seasons really. Every day is the same. There's no kind of urgency. It's kind of a state of limbo. There's not a lot of paying gigs in Los Angeles unless you're in television. And it gets kind of depressing because I love to work and I love to work all the time. And there I'd had deals with CBS and I had deals with other networks, and much of it just involved sitting around waiting for them to say, come in and read for this. And so you'd just spend all year just being at their disposal. I mean, they'd pay you good money and everything, but it's not as fun or engaging or enriching as like doing stand-up all the time. Yeah, so it was very different. And yeah, it's funny. I had a lovely house there. It was a little bungalow, and in the backyard there were lemon trees and orange trees, a grapefruit tree, a peach tree in the front yard. We were palm trees. It was really lovely. But, I wasn't working very much. I was just being paid to sit at home. So not as much fun as you'd think.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned to me about that experience was that you found that when you were speaking to executives, that they often really appreciated your talent and told you so, but they didn't know quite where to place you. They didn't know, who you would appeal to or what kind of character you could play, or you didn't fit into the paradigm, I guess.
That's exactly true. I mean, I would do music. I do characters. I do stand up. It's kind of like a cabaret show. And they're so used to just going, hey, there's Tim Allen. He talks about tool time. Well, he talks about, men and tools. Perfect. We'll do a show. Or Ray Romano has got a very specific point of view. And they can say, here he is, a sports writer, lives with his wife, and is kind of just a guy. Kevin James, same thing. King of Queens, a very simple guy with a hot wife who, for some reason, stays with him, even though she seems to think he's an idiot. Like, that's the paradigm of America at the time when I was down there. Like, I wrote two different pilots. One for CBS was I was an inner city priest who'd been brought from a very bucolic background into like an inner city situation. And we did that, and we just thought this is a different kind of workplace. It'd be fun. Mm-hmm. And they were like, and what's his name? Les Moonves, who was the head of CBS at the time, came and we did a reading of the script for him with Tony Shalhoub and John Cryer and me, and just like amazing people. And
wow.
He listened to it and said, I don't really like that idea. But I like him. He's kind of like the next Kevin James. And I was like, no, I don't think I like that at all. I've got a lot of things that I want to do, and this doesn't really address all of them. And sometimes I thought, it'd be easier if I just had one thing I was good at and just focused on that. It'd be a lot easier for people to slot me, and then I'd get a sitcom and it'd all work out great. But the second script we wrote was with Alan Zweibel, who was a writer for Saturday Night Live and wrote Gilda Radner's Broadway show. And we wrote a show called Hero of the Falls, which was a script about a guy who's a wedding photographer who has grander ideas that one day he'll be a real film director. And he is given these, it's strange, but he's given rings. He lived in Niagara Falls. It was called Legend of the Falls.
Right.
And he's given the wedding rings to do a kind of video montage with the falls in the background. And he puts them in his windowsill on little stands, and he's shooting it. And a monkey all of a sudden comes in and steals one of the rings and then disappears. So he's in trouble. And it turns out the father of the bride, is a mafioso, and he's going to be in trouble if he doesn't replace the ring. Mm-hmm. And, it's just kind of a weird, just a little odd. And once again, Les Moonves said, I just don't like monkeys. Like, he has a real dislike of monkeys. So that really put the kibosh on that story. So, it's just so capricious and strange, and, and I don't know, everybody thinks the way I speak is really bizarre in America. They think I have this accent that is not accessible. And, they asked me if I could just speak like a normal American, and,
right.
Stuff like that. And I'm just like, well, how about we find something where this all makes sense?
Yeah.
But it's a very weird place, trying to figure out what they want and, have a kind of happy medium of giving them what they want and also still doing what you want. It's hard to strike that balance,
Yeah. But since then, I mean, one thing that has changed is streaming, and streaming has certainly allowed for more unique broadcasting, or maybe we could even call it narrowcasting. I mean, look at what's happened with Schitt's Creek and what they've managed to accomplish, being a CBC show that that got picked up by Netflix, and how that has really opened up things for the people who are involved in that production.
Oh yeah, for sure. But the thing is that people cite that and say, "Oh, there's Schitt's Creek, and it got on Netflix and is now an American, won all these Emmys."
Mm-hmm.
But it had Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara on board, which are really bankable stars.
Yeah.
If it didn't have that, I don't know if CBC would have supported it as much as they did, or gotten out of the way and let them really just make the show they wanted to make. And same thing people say about, Working Moms. What a success, But it was kind of bankrolled by her father, Ivan Reitman really got behind it and it said, do this show to the CBC. And they said, yes, sir. And, people always cite, Kids in the Hall. It's like, this is like a CBC huge success. But the only reason it was on, I just think it was so uncharacteristic of the CBC. Lorne Michaels came to them and said, I'm doing this show with these guys and we'll have to broadcast it here and we'll broadcast it on HBO in the States. So it had that kind of weight behind it. And that's hard to get in Canada. I think it's becoming more like that in Canada. I think, you just have to find the bankability factors of it. But, it's funny because I look at the world of sitcoms and stuff like that now and comedies. And it's like, you already have to be famous to get a sitcom. You already have to be famous to get on TV, It's all these movie stars who don't want to travel around and do movies. They want to be at home and do sitcoms. It's a great life. Drive into the studio from your home and then, you do a table read. And then the next day you get the rewrites and do another table read. And the next day you just get up and walk through it. And then the fourth day you shoot it. It's not a bad life.
No.
No, it's a really good life, and you can get paid really well, and you can stay in your house. It's changing a lot, certainly with streaming services, because people are more. I think the comedy palette in America has become a lot broader. It used to be quite narrow and prosaic. I think Americans, as you can see in politics, really distrust intelligence, distrust. Educated or like eggheadedness. And also, as a result, you had basically lots of sitcoms that were just repeats of, the Honeymooners, a guy, kind of a schlubby guy with a hot wife who's out of his league. And she's always picking on him. And he's like, one of these days. And you just go, why is she staying married to this moron? Mm. That's what I think all of Americans look at each other as, I can relate to that. And, and I was in the American version of Fawlty Towers, but I got to the set to do my episode and it was like, this is the most beautiful hotel I've ever seen. Like the set you built. It's like beautiful. And the location of the hotel was on the Pacific Coast Highway overlooking the sea. And it was gorgeous. And you're just like, you've taken away everything about it that made it what it is, like this failing hotel with miserable people in it who hate each other. And Americans, for them, everything is fantasy. Like television is fantasy for the most part. And like network television is definitely fantasy. Like you want to see beautiful people doing things. Like Friends, for me, was kind of like, oh, geez, now they figured out that beautiful people can do comedy. So now we have nowhere else to be ugly people at all on television, And it's just on Friends, they were like, they all lived in these beautiful Manhattan apartments, huge Manhattan apartments, penthouses. And you're like, how do you do this? But Americans completely accept it,
Yeah.
So it's very strange. Or like Sex in the City. And you're like, how does the main character, she writes a column for a newspaper, and she can afford a Chanel suit every day, and her whole, it's like, do you know how much columnists make, even for like the New York Times? Not very much. Not like that kind of money. It's crazy, but people accept it. And that's the baseline that they want. But streaming and cable, I guess you'd say, give you more than, like, you can have baskets, you can have very weird alternative, like Eastbound and Down. You can have very niche and strange things, that people can seek out, and television's become more seeking out what you want,
Right.
instead of being dictated to you what you're going to see. And that's what network television is. Network relies on sponsorship, so they have to have a certain moral code that they can't defy. But when you go to cable or Netflix, you're paying them and subscribing, so you're giving them permission to push the envelope and push the boundaries. So it's exciting, and you can find things that are very weird. And finally, I think that's been the thing that's broadened the American palate more than anything.
Sure, I think and HBO had a big part in opening up that as well, with home subscription and not having to kowtow to advertisers. I mean, you see that all the time on Bill Maher's show, and John Oliver as well. I mean, they say stuff all day long on those episodes that you would not be able to say if you had big corporate sponsors.
Well, even not like, and those are very what would you call it? They're nonfiction, like non-scripted. Yeah. But I mean, the one that for me really blew the doors off was Jerry Shandling doing.
Gary Shandling's The Larry Sanders Show.
And that like had a gay character that wasn't just like, he was a real person, not a caricature of a gay person. It had weird situations, and it was really, push the envelope, and, it was almost a mockery or a parody of network television,
Yeah.
So that could only be done on HBO. So that's it's absolutely true that kind of gave producers and creators permission to push the envelope.
Yeah. Well, you're one of the few people who's had the opportunity to have an eponymously named show, the Seán Cullen show you did on the CBC. What did you learn from that experience?
Well, the people don't like weird stuff in Canada. I mean, it's not their fault. The problem, one thing that I learned was that I wrote all 6 episodes, and I wrote them too long for network TV. Like, they all had to be 22 minutes long, and I wrote them way too long. It was my first real time writing for television. And, so we had to edit them down from, 40 minutes to 22, and the show suffered because of that. And also, it was just too much weird. I think if I did it again, I'd start very prosaically with weird elements and teach people what to expect, pull them along with us, and not expect them to jump on board with everything right away. I think you have to educate your audience a little bit in Canada. People always ask me, what is your, why are Canadians, why do they have such a great sense of humor? And I say, well, it's not necessarily true. If you see what comedy is done on Canadian television, we're still doing, like, 22 has been on for 100 years? Mm-hmm. And it's basically just putting on hats and wigs and, regurgitating what happened in the news that week. It's not really reinventing the wheel. It's when, like, we had air farce for many years, and you're just like, that's so like 1960s, 50s kind of template for comedy. And it's easy though, because the audience watches it and they go, oh, I recognize this because I watch the news. And so I get the joke, and I have a good sense of humor because of that. You don't really challenge them to come up with anything to push them out of their comfort zone,
Right.
And because it's a taxpayer money, CBC, and I'm saying CBC just because they're really the only ones who make any scripted television in Canada for the most part. And they have the mandate to tell Canadian stories, So that they have to appeal to everyone in the whole country because the whole country is paying for them. So my show was so weird, and they got tons of pushback from people saying, I don't get it. This stupid. Why is this money being wasted on this stupid show? And I'm like, but if we'd been able to build our audience and pull them along with us, I think it would have been a lot different. But I think I learned a lot from it. By the time you learned all that stuff, though, you were canceled. I remember going into Slocko Klimke. This is the typical, but Slocko Klimke was the head of comedy at that point, the head of programming. And he had come from news. That was his background. But then he was in the head of all programming, scripted, comedy, everything. And he just had me in and said, you know what? Comedy's supposed to be funny, and this just isn't funny. And I said, oh, in your vast experience as a comedian, you don't think it's funny. I just was like, well, I don't know how seriously to take that. I can't take it very seriously because I've been doing it for 20 years and you haven't. So, but at that point, I learned a lot, and I think I would have done things differently. And if we'd had a second season, but you don't get a second chance, And I've been trying and pitching and doing all kinds of things, trying to get back on there. And we'll see. Maybe one day. I'm working on a new project. Maybe that'll happen. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the things that you were saying that were a detriment to you are the things that are on the stage are your selling points, talking about having a different viewpoint or a different, a way of seeing the world, or calling it weird or unusual or whatever. And then being able to stretch pieces out longer than you would normally for an audience that maybe has a short attention span is what's had you filling theaters. But I guess it's a big difference is filling a theater that has specific number of seats, and then being able to grow an audience. And if you don't get a shot, if you don't get more than a season, it's hard to do that. I mean, it used to be, especially if you look at the music business, it used to be that a record company would decide to promote an artist, and they would give them 5 albums before they decided whether or not they were going to drop them or move on. These days, you kind of get one shot. If you can't get lightning in a bottle in that one album, then they move on to the next thing. But how do you learn anything in that short amount of time?
Absolutely. And what's funny is comedy is a strange thing, because I think the longer you do it, the better you get at it, and the more deeply you understand the medium and the craft. And like Seinfeld didn't get on television until he'd been doing comedy for 20 years,
Sure.
25 years. And he was the biggest comic that wasn't on TV ever. And so they gave him a show. And even that, his first season was not well liked by anybody. But he was Jerry Seinfeld, so they gave him a second season, and they figured it out.
Well, Cheers was a failure in its first season. It didn't do very well at all, but they stuck with it.
Oh, for sure.
And it gained an audience.
Yeah. And you just people have to get to know the characters. And in sitcoms, they have to get to know the characters, because sitcoms are like, these are my friends I'm going to meet every week. And you have to get to know them and start to see the patterns and feel their, and as a writer and as a performer, you have to start to figure out what the most effective ways of presenting these characters and their points of view and developing their background to make people care about them, very personal. So, and comedy is very personal. That's why it's hard to do, and hard to take it to television, because you don't have an audience with you to sense and empathize with and feel their energy and move with it and give them what they want in the moment. It's very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that you have been involved in over the years is literature. Does that offer you an opportunity that the stage and television didn't?
Well, yeah. I mean, I love books, and I've always loved books. I love writing, and it's been a huge part of it. Reading's been a huge part of my life.
Yeah.
And I was approached by someone from Penguin, who is the editor of children's entertainment at that time at Penguin. And she said, my son loves your radio show on CBC. I just did this replacement show during the summer. And it was just me rambling and then playing music I liked. And she said, would you be interested in writing books for someone around his age? And I said, well, I can give it a try. I'd love to. So what's hard about books is it's finite and frozen on the page, you know. You're constantly second guessing yourself, and it's a lonely project. You're always by yourself, and your audience doesn't respond right away, and you probably won't get a response for like a year after you finish writing, you know. So it's very different, and it was a good experience because it taught me discipline and how to stay at it and write every day and get to the end. And that's just the biggest part, you know. It's the hardest part. It's just starting and then getting to the end. And that's, you know, most people say, oh, I'd love to write a novel. I've got a novel idea and I'd like to do it. And I said, well, are you writing it?
Yeah. Just
sit down. That's the hard part. Sit down and write right now. And they're like, oh, it's just hard. And I said, yes, it is. So it was it's a very good experience and absolutely amazing. And I'd like to one day develop the books into a television project if I could. But it was the most rewarding thing to see my book on a shelf in a store, in a bookstore, or on a library shelf. It was one of the most amazing things.
Yeah. And you wrote, so far you've written 2 books for 2 of your children. When you're writing those books, were you writing specifically thinking of them?
I started writing the first book right after my son, my wife and I had split up, and my son and my ex-wife had moved down to Los Angeles because I had a house there, and they took that house and I took the one in Canada. And I was missing him. So I decided I would write this book, and it's called Hamish X, and my son's name is Hamish. And so it was really for him, you know, a story for him. And I wrote 3 books in that series. And then I married again, and I had 2 more kids. And one of them's name is Brendan. He's my second oldest son. And so I started writing a book for him. But the main character's name is Brendan. And he's a human. He lives in a human family, but he finds out he's actually a fairy, you know, that and then his fairy family and his human family kind of collide and strange things happen. And now I'm working on a new book for my daughter, Cleopatra. And so I'm working on a science fiction story for her called Cleopatra Crash Saves the World. So it's a fun science fiction thing. It's a bit of a different departure for me and different subject matter, but I'm just trying to get it out there. And
yeah, and that's a pretty cool legacy as well for your kids to have that and hold on to.
I'd like them to think that I was thinking of them.
So it seems like you've done it all. I mean, in terms of show business, is there any artistic avenue you haven't explored, or something else that you'd like to do, or what does the future hold for Seán Cullen?
Well, I've written a couple of screenplays that I'd like to get produced, or at least read by someone who could produce them. I'm working on that. I'd really like to have some of my books adapted for television. And I'd like to get a successful television project on the air. That would be really wonderful. So I really just want to work until I'm dead, basically. Keep going and always be busy. That's just, you know, the good thing about having so many interests is you can just flip as one thing kind of goes cold. You can move to another one and stir that up and keep busy, you know. So I just like to be busy.
Yeah, I think retirement is something that people sort of pine for because a lot of people don't like their work. If you do like your work, if you love your work, why retire?
Exactly. It's a joy when it's going well. So I really would love to keep doing it until no one wants me anymore. We'll see.
Well, I wish you all the success with your future projects. Like I said to you before, I really appreciate the work that you've done. And when I first got specifically into improv, my friends and I were always clamoring to get tickets for your shows because when we looked around at all the people who were doing the same sort of work that we wanted to do, you were at the top of the heap. So that's kind of where I first got my appreciation for your work. So it's been fun to watch you, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with next.
Okay, well, it's very kind of you, and thanks very much, David. Thanks for talking to me. Have a wonderful, wonderful life.
You too. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it, Seán. Take care. My thanks to Mr. Seán Cullen for spending time with me and for sharing his cool story. Thanks again to Jerry Stamp, who wrote and performed the Cool Story theme song and all of the other jingles and stings that appear on the show. Do yourselves a favor and look for Jerry's music wherever you stream. And finally, thank you for listening. Until next time, pura vida.
Everybody's had some adventures. Everybody's had a few close calls. Everybody's got a story. What's yours?